Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. Hope everybody out there is having a wonderful day. What a time to be alive. What a time to be playing Golgari midrange. We are here to talk about Modern Horizons, kind of the first major batch of spoilers from said set. If you out there are just stumbling across this content, know that on this channel we wear our black and green tinted glasses at all times. In other words, we are talking about things in the context, of the BG-Rock deck in Modern. So know that going in, this content may still be enjoyable and informative for you, but we will be filtering things through that lens. As always, I thank you so much to my supporters on Patreon, who help this channel grow and who help make this all possible. Now, without further ado, let's talk about the first three major potential playables for us in Modern Horizons. Alright, so the first thing we need to talk about is something that just dropped a few hours maybe, before the recording of this video, which is the new rare land cycle in Modern Horizons. These are enemy-colored lands. The community has not yet decided on a name for them. Maybe they're going to be called Horizon Lands, maybe Canopy Lands, maybe something else like Crack Lands, crack your Horizon Canopy. It's a common turn of phrase, but whatever they are basically the modern staple Horizon Canopy, but in enemy color. So we have Fiery Islet, Nurturing Peatland, Silent Clearing, Sunbaked Canyon, and Waterlogged Grove. So that's the new land cycle. These are, mark my words, going to be eternal format staples in, and they're going to be casual staples as well. They're going to see heavy play in many formats, including Modern. But of course, my friends, the one that we really care about the most, the one that is of the most direct benefit to our interests, is Nurturing Peatland. It is in our colors. It's some nice Noah Bradley art, very Golgari with a little bit of glow to it that probably is going to look pretty good in foil if I had to guess. New life is born within its shadows. Very thematic, very cool, and very good for us, in my opinion. Now, what does this do? Well, for the uninitiated who haven't been on the receiving end of Horizon Canopy, you are trading away, you are using your life as a resource, which is something that is basically ubiquitous in Magic as a whole. Whether it be, if you're in a limited event, declining to sacrifice a creature as a chump blocker, or even trade off one of your creatures, instead choosing to go lower on your life total for the benefit of a better attack when you get to go, or a better board presence, or some other reason. It goes from something as simple and basic as that all the way to a deck like Grixis Shadow that aggressively spends its own life to make its own shadows bigger. Anything and everything in between is fair game. Your life is a resource. So here we are using the life as a very heavy resource, and make no mistake, paying one life every time you tap a land, it does add up. So I want to exercise caution. By no means does this replace Blooming Marsh. By no means does this see play as a 4 of in our deck. Nothing like that, in my opinion. That is too aggressive. However, what does it do? Why are we so excited about this land despite the fact that we have to pay a life to use it? Well, the mere fact that for the low cost of 1 colorless mana and tapping it, you can sacrifice it to draw a card. It is a redraw, and that is so absolutely indescribably powerful, I cannot even tell you. Simply the fact that when you are in any situation, from needing a slightly more efficient play to desperately top decking for the one and only card that will get you out of a certain lock, Nurturing Peatland is your guy. Nurturing Peatland can help you get there, and in the Golgari midrange list and in midrange decks in general, you already play a lot of utility lands. Lands that can help you cast your spells while also providing additional value at a cost, right? It always comes at a cost. It's never free. And in this case, I think the cost is well worth it. Now, like I said, we can't run it as a 4 of. It doesn't necessarily fully displace any other land we've been running, but I think we can clearly accommodate 1 in the Golgari lists, and we can probably accommodate 2. However, of course, all of this is subject to the meta and subject to testing, but I think 1 to 2 of this land is where you'd want to be. And the final thing I'll say about this land specifically is that we are clearly the best BGX deck to leverage this. Jund, Abs, and Sultai, they not only need the 3rd color, so the dual land is not as impressive here, making just green and black. Their land bases are also a lot more painful to begin with. They also have fewer flex slots in their land base as well. So all of those factors together means that Golgari midrange, the Rock, can leverage Nurturing Peatland way better than any other BGX deck. Alright, my friends, so Nurturing Peatland is the bomb, right? But how does it fit into our deck? Where do we play it? Well, you can expect people to try everything from playing fewer lands to playing maybe up to 25 lands, just saying we've got the flood insurance, we can cash in our Peatlands if we get there, if we're too flooded, and it just helps our deck be more consistent. I don't know if we want to begin by iterating with changing the land base numbers as a whole, so let's begin just by considering what our utility land slots are, what our flex slots are. Field of Ruin, a lot of people might think is a utility land slot, and technically it is. Technically this is one of these non-essential lands because it doesn't help us cast our spells all that well, at least right off the bat. It can fix our mana, but mainly it's there to disrupt opposing creature lands and opposing decks that depend on assembling certain lands like Tron. Now, again, a lot of people might think Field of Ruin is kind of a flex slot. I don't actually know that it is. Not with Tron in the number 1 spot in the meta. I don't know if we can realistically cut any Fields of Ruin. I just simply don't know that it's an option. Now, granted, trimming one is fine for testing, but I certainly don't think Peatland should replace Field of Ruin, 3 for 3 or anything like that. So what else could we possibly cut to make room for this nice new land? Well, other flex slots are these creature lands. We've got Treetop Village and Hissing Quagmire. Now, beyond that, you could also say that this 5th fetch land, the Marsh Flats, is a definite flex spot, and maybe, just maybe, even the 2nd basic forest. These are all options, and they have varying pros and cons, considering shaving maybe a Hissing Quagmire and a Marsh Flats for 2 Peatlands, or just one of those 2 things for 1 Peatland. Those might be realistic options. At the end of the day, we don't need to figure that out in this particular video. That will come over time with testing and with communication and with more theory crafting. But what I want to say is the sheer power of Peatland not only comes in the fact that it's a redraw, but that it also is a dual land that enters untapped. So at the end of the day, if we make our changes correctly, we could, in theory, end up with a land base that not only has more utility than it currently does now, but also better facilitates us casting more difficult to cast spells like Liliana on turn 3. It might give us more of the colored sources that we need at the times that we need them. However, as always, this will come at the expense of our life total, so the balance will need to be found. The Aristotelian mean will need to be discovered, but I am very, very excited about this land. It's not all roses, though, my friends, because we're not the only ones who get that toy. Far from it. You just saw the 5 different lands they've printed. These are all going to go in various decks of the format, and I think most people right now are predicting that the big winner is Boros Burn. The presence of these Horizon lands does double duty for Burn. Number 1, it's a dual land in Burn's best color pairing that lets them redraw, and that redraw effect is so important for Burn. That is a critical mass deck with a flurry of cheap spells that often loses games, especially against us, when they're disrupted and then they flood out, and then they lose to a slower deck. So Burn not only gets a ton of mileage out of Sunbaked Canyon, Burn also gets a significant amount of benefit from other decks playing these Horizon lands because, of course, they're paying life, and Burn preys upon decks that pay life, just like we prey upon decks that mulligan, right? So The stock of burn is expected to rise immensely when these cards enter the format for both of those reasons. However, I think that's ultimately a good thing for us, even though we have to respect that reality, and we can potentially take steps to prepare for it by including more anti-burn technology in our decks. I still just think burn is such a fine matchup for us that I don't care. I don't care. And to go back to the fact that we mentioned that Golgari can leverage these lands way better than Jund, Abs, and Sultai, we also have the tools Fulminator Mage that we're probably a little bit more likely to play than some of those decks, but maybe not, depends on the variant. More importantly, Field of Ruin. We can hit opposing Horizon lands way better than other BGX variants can. So not only can we leverage these better, we can also deal with the opponent's ones better. There will be plenty of times where the opponent plays a Sunbaked Canyon or, let's see, Waterlogged Grove, Silent Clearing, Fiery Islet, you name it. They're going to use them as actual lands. They're going to be tapped out. We're going to have a really clean window to hit it with our Field of Ruin or something like that. We just, I think, are going to be fine in a meta where a lot of the stuff abounds compared to a lot of other decks that these cards don't really benefit and can indeed punish pretty hard. So those are my thoughts in general on the Horizon lands. Very excited that we have Nurturing Peatland in our deck now, and I think we're going to be fine even against Sunbaked Canyon in Burn and similar decks that benefit greatly from it. However, that's that. Let's talk about the Force Cycle. Alright, my friends, so the first card that we want to talk about in the Force Cycle, we're only going to talk about the green and the black ones. We're not going to talk about Force of Negation specifically. So we're going to talk about Force of Vigor. Now, in general, before we get into this card specifically, I just want to mention, I think people are sleeping on the power of the Force Cycle already. I think maybe it's because Force of Negation was the first one spoiled, and a lot of people were hoping for Force of Will, and that didn't materialize. Maybe expectations have been lowered, and therefore people are kind of dismissing the Force Cycle altogether, or they're a little bit lower on it than they would otherwise be. I think people are sleeping on the cycle. I think it's more powerful than the consensus dictates right now. And so what do we think about Force of Vigor? Well, honestly, Force of Vigor is a pretty good card. It's really, really not bad at all. You think about how so many decks are going to be locked out by various artifacts or enchantments, whether it be Blood Moon, whether it be Chalice of the Void, things like that. This card gets around those really cleanly and potentially for free, or just hard cast depending on the situation, depending on the lock piece. You also think about the other end of the spectrum for artifact decks specifically, where they're the affinity variants that are dumping out their hands nice and early. It is really nice to make a 2-for-2 trade, pitching a card to the Force and then spending the Force itself to slow down the opponent. Like 2-for-2 is even on resources, but slowing down the opponent against those hyper-linear, hyper-fast robots decks is really, really big game. So what do we think about Force of Vigor and BG the Rock? All of what I just said is true. However, a couple major problems with including this in our deck. First and foremost, I don't know about you guys, but let's pop back over to my list here. Look at the look at the casting costs here. My list is trending more and more over time away from green cards and more toward black cards, and potentially, depending on the meta, more toward artifacts as well. So I think that we are not a deck that can reliably pay this for the pitch cost and cast it for free. Beyond that, we do not strictly need an effect like this, because we already play so many catch-all answers. We play the decays, the pulses, the trophies that can hit artifacts and enchantments already. None of those lock pieces like Chalice and Blood Moon are particularly good against us. The traditional affinity matchup for us is great. Hardened Scales is a little bit tougher, but again, there are probably better cards to dedicate to Hardened Scales if you really want to beat that deck. So I think, thoughts on Force of Vigor to sum up, Number one, I think in general people are underrating the Force cycle, including Force of Vigor. But number two, as far as it goes in our deck, I don't really see in the current meta a major need for it. However, if you've got a few more green cards than I do in your BG deck, and if you've got a meta that's overrun by these types of artifact and enchantment-based decks, you could definitely do worse than playing the Force of Vigor. It's a nice 2-for-1 if you're hard casting it too, right? Definitely nothing wrong with that at all. The final thing I'll quickly mention that could potentially have been a factor to change my evaluation of it, but sadly is not. This cannot deal with a resolved Mycosynth Lattice plus Karn the Great Creator locked, because Mycosynth Lattice turns all the cards in your hand colorless, so you don't have any green cards to pitch. So unless you've got the open mana, you can float it in response. This doesn't help you against the terror of the format, Karn the Great Creator plus Mycosynth Lattice. So potentially a decent card to have access to in our archetype, but for now, I think we're probably going to pass on this, again, with the exception perhaps of local specific metas. Alright, my friends, last but certainly not least, we are going to talk about Force of Despair. 3 mana black instant. If it's not your turn, you may exile a black card from your hand rather than pay the spell's mana cost. Destroy all creatures that entered the battlefield this turn. Now, once again, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I could be wrong, but I think in general, right now, people are underrating the Force cycle, and they are kind of sleeping on the potential power of these cards. Now, I understand that their power, their ceiling is conditional, but a big thing to recognize is that the floor is not that low either, simply because these are a lot more hard castable than Force of Will ever was, right? So, what do we think about Force of Despair? And by the way, sorry about the slightly lower quality image here. We had to go to a different source to get the translation, but in any case, awesome card thematically, great name, great artwork, absolutely love it. It's going to be another really cool foil for us if you're playing with foils. And I honestly really like how this fits into our deck in a structural sense. So one of the ways that we lose games on BG the Rock, they're kind of two main ways. Number one is if the opponent goes underneath us. This can help solve that. If they're going underneath us, it's almost always with creatures in some regard, whether it be burn with a creature start, whether it be a creature-based deck like Counters Company, whether it be just a good old-fashioned Ether Vial or Tribal or otherwise aggressive deck. They're going underneath us. That's one way we can lose games. If we have, if we're just a step behind, we have the answers, but we're a little too slow, maybe we're on the draw. And the other way we can lose games is the so-called wrong half of the deck problem, especially in games, in pre-sideboard games, where we draw the disruption that does not line up well against our opponent's deck instead of the cards that do. That's kind of a inherent flaw of our archetype, I guess, is we're trying to do a little bit of everything, so sometimes we have the wrong half of the deck. Force of Despair helps mitigate both of those things. Of course, the fact that it can be cast for free and can be a really big blowout a lot of the time helps stop decks from going underneath us. And the fact that we have to pitch a card to it is, of course, not ideal when we're a resource, when we're competing on the resource front. But number one, we've got that wrong half of the deck problem. We can pitch the quote-unquote wrong card. And number two, we have the ability to, specifically thinking of how this synergizes with cards like Dark Confidant and discard spells. So Dark Confidant can help us rebuild after 2-for-1ing ourselves, even if that's the case with like a must-answer creature that we have to force early. Often we'll be 2-for-2ing and it's fine, but even if we have to 2-for-1 ourselves, Bob can help us rebuild, but Bobs are often clunky in multiples. You can pitch Bobs to subsequent forces. Sometimes discard spells become dead as the game goes on. You can pitch it to force, so on and so forth. Sometimes, even against creatures, your Fatal Push is dead. If they've got a Reality Smasher or something, you can pitch it to force. Now, I understand that playing bad cards just because you can pitch them Or, that's been an argument in the case, well, even if this card's bad, you can still pitch it to Collective Brutality and Liliana. I understand that that's not a great argument, and neither is its inverse, which is you can pitch your dead or bad cards to Force, therefore Force is good. That is far from the whole of my argument in favor of this card. It is just something to consider. But, like I said, it's helping to some degree solve the wrong half of the deck problem. It's helping to a more significant degree to help against the decks going underneath us problem. And again, it's very hard castable. Only 3 mana instant speed. Very, very hard castable. Our deck is already structured to accommodate this 1 BB mana cost. And yeah, now where it fits, main deck versus side, I probably lean more towards side to begin with, and I don't know if it's more than like a 2 of it the most, so I'm not saying this is revolutionizing our archetype or anything, but again, I do think it's a very, very powerful tool. I do think people are sleeping on it just a tad, and now let's take a look at what decks it might be good against. Okay, so right off the bat, we see a couple decks in the top 5 that this card is no good against, which is why I'm thinking it is indeed going to be a sideboard card, at least to begin with, optimally. Of course, people will test it main deck, and that's fine. Maybe that'll end up being correct. In fact, we play cards like Fatal Push main deck that are dead, or close to dead in these matchups as well. But, not great against Tron, not good at all against Control, but humans. Think of humans. How often do they go turn 1 Ether Vial and then turn 2 Vial out a Champion of the Parish, play a 2-drop? Well, guess what? You can 2 for 2 them right away with Force of Despair. Now, 2 for 2 again is not a game-ending blowout or anything, but that's a very common start. And again, we want to slow them down. We want to prevent them from going underneath us. Our cards scale as the game goes on. Tarmogoyf, Scavenging Ooze, Planeswalker repeated value, so on and so forth. We want to stop the decks from going underneath us. It's a very viable play early like that, and it's a very viable play in the mid-game, whether we're hard casting it or pitching it. You look at a deck like Jeskai Phoenix, might not look impressive to begin with. We're talking about, potentially just destroying things that can recur, but we disrupt the Jeskai Phoenix deck, or is it Phoenix is more common, or looks like, I don't know why it's Grixis symbols and Jeskai in the name. Anyway, Phoenix. We disrupt Phoenix very, very well, whether it be by stripping their hand so they cannot easily put together another 3-turn spell to get the Phoenixes back, or whether it be by actually disrupting the graveyard with Scavenging Ooze or with Harder Hate out of the side. We can really leverage a card like Force of Despair against Phoenix. At worst, it's going to buy us time, maybe kills a Thing in the Ice as well. They have those turns where they go Thing, and then, maybe like turn 4, turn 5, if it's been a more cagey game, they go Thing, and then they go crazy, getting back all the Phoenixes, taking a bunch of counters off a Thing. Well, we can really blow them out with this card. Dredge, it's a similar situation, except we need the follow-up disruption, or we need like a Kalidas down or something to make it really good. But at worst against Dredge, it buys time. We definitely have worse cards in our 75 by far against Dredge. But then you get into stuff like, it's okay in the mid-range matchups. Taking care of an early Angler is potentially nice. It's going to depend on the situation. It's okay, even in the BGX mirrors. There are going to be times when, the opponent just plays 2 creatures for a turn and you get to very cleanly, tempo positive, resource even 2 for 2. Or again, hard cast it and just really get a good advantage. But, looking at more decks like this, you can obviously see the immense blowout potential that it has against a deck like Hardened Scales. But it's even interesting against non-obvious candidates like Burn and Amulet Titan. It's big game. It's very big game to kill a Goblin Guide, especially after you let its trigger resolve, when you're on the draw. Even if you have to 2 for 1 yourself, that's potentially well worth it. Same can apply to Amulet Titan. Everything from, it's awkward to sideboard against Amulet Titan because your Fatal Pushes and your Abrupt Decays are, they're okay. Your Collective Brutality is not the best, but at the same time, you kind of need to leave in stuff to kill Sakura Tribe Scout and Azusa. Well, maybe Force of Despair does a little double duty in terms of potentially, getting those early creatures or getting a Titan before it can attack, you can see how this card becomes very, very interesting in a whole lot of matchups. And then, of course, you're getting into decks like Affinity and Infect, where it's just absolutely incredible. Again, against the big mana, against the control, maybe not so much. Hollow One, is there a better answer to the Hollow One nut draw of like 2 or 3 turn 1 Hollow Ones? No, there really isn't. And even if they're not nut drawing us, Force of Despair is still going to be really good in that matchup. Similar things apply to Mono Red Phoenix, as I said about Izzet Phoenix. And again, in your Prison decks, against Ad Nauseam, you don't want it. Against Prison, you don't want it. So this is probably a sideboard card. We're starting to see Eldrazi decks now. Think of how well this lines up against Matter Reshaper. If you're trying to spot remove Matter Reshaper, it does not line up well at all against Reshaper. Reality Smasher. You're trying to spot remove a Reality Smasher, you're already 2 for 1-ing yourself. This lets you, at worst, do the same thing without taking the 5 damage from the haste threat, and all that stuff. You get to do it on your own terms. And of course, by that stage of the game, you might just be able to hardcast it. So, pretty decent against the top-end Eldrazi stuff. Storm. This is our clean answer to Empty the Warrens, which is the biggest win condition, the most realistic win condition they can get through our Disruption post-side. And again, there might be windows in which it's just simply correct to kill a Mana Bear with it. Probably not that common. This, again, is more for answering Empty, but it's even fine against Storm. And then I've mentioned these company decks. Red-Green Eldrazi, it's looking really good there. Mardu Pyromancer, I've said this card looks a little medium in mid-range matchups, but it might be better against token-generating ones like Mardu and Abzan than it is against, Rock and Shadow. But seems very, very playable there, depending on your 75. And then if you're talking about Bogles, forget about it. This is just another way to get around their hexproof. We already have the Liliana Edict. We already have Liliana's Triumph. If you play that, this is going to make Bogles just extra sad against us. Against these other Vile decks like Azorius Spirits, Merfolk, similar decks, you can see how this is just so playable at so many stages of the game against those decks. Other things that I mentioned earlier on the Facebook group, we've got less common decks, but still ones that see play like 8-Whack and Zoo. This absolutely blows them out so hard it's not even funny. Stuff like Kiln Fiend, combo-esque all-in aggro decks it's very good against. It's good against the infinite combos like Restoration Angel plus Kiki Jiki or the Copycat Saheeli deck. Honestly, you name it, any creature-based deck, we can find decent windows for this. So, again, these Force cards, there's no question. They're very, very hard to evaluate correctly in terms of their overall power, in terms of sideboard versus main deck, in terms of what they should see play instead of, and in how many numbers. I'm not pretending to have the answers to all of those things, but I will make the claim that people are slightly to moderately underrating the Force cycle, and I'm very excited to have Force of Despair in our deck moving forward. Alright, my friends, so those were my thoughts on the big 3 additions that we've had to the BG-Rock archetype. We've got the 2 Force cards in our colors, and of course we have the Peatland, the black-green Horizon Canopy. So let me know what your thoughts are on all of this stuff. I will be covering more spoilers as they drop here for you on this channel, talking about how they fit into our deck, at least in terms of how I view the likelihood of that happening. So thanks again to everybody who supports this content. Thanks for watching. Look forward to hearing your feedback, and I will talk to you soon. I hope you have a great day.